Hello, Fred Keating here. Welcome to Fred Keating and Friends, conversations with people who make a difference.
If you don't recognize the human side of astronomy, you're missing all the fun. You're missing all the things that makes it so challenging. And you're demanding certainty in a field where if there was certainty, it would be boring.
My mission is to bring you insightful guests sharing how you can make a difference in your life and the lives around you by making the best use of your time and talent.
You've got to have enough successes that you at least have hope. And you've got to have enough failures to keep yourself humble. Astronomy works because, as the International Astronomical Union puts it, we all live under the same sky.
I'm not sure any little boy or girl who loves looking up at a starry, starry night ever goes to bed dreaming, when I grow up, I want to be the Pope's astronomer and spend my days at Castel Gandolfo, the Pope's summer palace in Italy, and travel the world speaking with some of the most famous people at NASA and other national space programs and governments and observatories, and have offices in different countries and universities, and fund educational opportunities for young people, and join science organizations and associations to keep exploring the universe. And well, I'm not sure my guest today ever had that specific and detailed a daydream, but he did have a very interesting number of life experiences that not only prepared him for, but also propelled him into exactly that kind of stellar, no pun intended, career. Winner of prestigious peer-judged awards for breakthrough research in heavenly bodies such as meteors, asteroids, exoplanets, and such. Internationally known as a speaker on issues involving worlds we can see out there, as well as those that remain, for the moment, unseen but perceived or theorized, he is blunt, basic Brother Guy Consolmagno, S.J., as in Society of Jesus, also known as the Jesuits, the largest and some would say most influential of all the religious orders of the Roman Catholic Church. The Jesuits, priests, and brothers are known as much for advancing knowledge in various arts and sciences, as well as in matters of philosophy and faith. In fact, for the first time in the Christian Church's history, the current Pope, here in 2019, is himself a Jesuit, Pope Francis I. And it was he who appointed Brother Guy director of the Vatican Observatory in September of 2015. So Brother Guy is in fact the Pope's astronomer and an ambassador from the Vatican to the global scientific community in the areas of faith and science, and describing his ability to embrace both. Allow me to introduce you to Brother Guy Consolmagno, a man who often claims life is decisions based on inadequate information. Well, if that's true, I'm feeling pretty lifelike myself at the moment, so time to get a little more information. Here's my meet and greet with Brother Guy Consolmagno, S.J. Well, here we are just off the campus of University of Arizona in Tucson, and I'm sitting in the cozy bungalow of Brother Guy Consolmagno. He's a Jesuit brother. We actually attended the same school, somewhat separately. I was a few years ahead of Brother Guy, and he was kind enough to allow me to participate in the 2019 Vatican Observatory Faith and Astronomy Workshop, which was held in the shadow of Picture Rocks in the Saguaro National Park, just outside of Tucson. Thank you so much for that invitation, and thank you so much for accepting mine and joining me today.
It's a delight to be here.
Okay, hold that thought. I want to ask you how you got started in your fascination with the skies and the stars.
Well, as you mentioned, I'm pretty much the same generation as you, just a few years younger. That means that when I was in kindergarten, Sputnik was launched. When I was a senior in high school, that was just after the people had landed on the moon. Space science was everything and everywhere. And certainly in the 1960s, every little boy, and I mean boys because it was unfortunately not girls so much, was encouraged. We were going to be scientists. We were going to beat the Russians. We were going to, put our own spacecraft in orbit. And there was a big push towards science, towards math, towards engineering, which matched kind of my own interests in it because as a little kid, I was the kind of kid who took clocks apart. I was the one who wanted to know how everything worked. And I had a particular fascination with the sky because growing up in Michigan, we had a summer place on Lake Huron. You could see the sky at night in the summertime. It was glorious. On top of that, I really was encouraged by my father. He himself had always wanted to be an astronomer, but being an Italian kid in Boston in the 30s, that was kind of limited. But he had a real love of the sky. He was also a navigator in B-17s during the war, where they taught him the navigation stars. So as a kid, I had, the major constellations and the summer triangle and things like that pointed out to me. So I had this knowledge of science and this knowledge of astronomy all around me all the time I was growing up.
Did you have a telescope that you had access to at the time?
I did. We had started out with a little Gilbert telescope, and then when I was in the 7th grade, I collected trading stamps. You remember those? You go to the grocery store, and you would get a sheet of stamps. You get enough books of stamps. You could get an oven or something, or an iron, or who knows what. I saved up 17 3/4 books of stamps in order to get a little telescope, and I used that all through high school.
I used those gold stamps. It took me 3 years to get enough to get a tennis racket because my mother shopped at a store that didn't have the kind of stamps I needed. But I hear you. And Michigan would certainly have had less light pollution then than it may have now, yes?
Well, the world had less light pollution then than it does now. Light pollution, Pope Benedict had a wonderful phrase about light pollution in a homily he gave on Holy Saturday night when, all of St. Peter's is dark and they walk in with candles. And he says, our human tendency to try to blot out God's lights with our own light is a wonderful analogy for what sin is all about.
Holy cow. That, well, we got into religion real quickly there, didn't we?
Yeah. I can be pretty passionate and pretty religious when it comes to keeping the skies dark.
I hear you. In fact, I've become a student of how every mountain peak in southern Arizona here seems to have one or many observatories and telescopes on it. Is that part of what drew you here for your postgraduate work?
Certainly, I came here as a graduate student because it was one of the best astronomy departments in the world, and it was one of the best because of this combination of having high mountains, being far to the south, having dry skies, so your odds of actually getting a cloudless night are pretty good. And even if you're doing theoretical work, you need to be in a community of astronomers who are doing everything. This means you've got people to talk to. This means you've got a sense of the observations you're trying to match. In addition, it draws other scientists to come here to give a colloquium and what they've come up with that's new and different. And this, I think, is one of the most important aspects of science that you forget, that you never get to when you're just learning out of a book in the grade school or the high school. You got to memorize the answers in the back of the book. Science is this community. Science is this conversation. And a conversation is not about people telling each other things that they already know. It's not a conversation of, well, I read in the back of my book and you read in the back of your book. It's a conversation because everybody is groping and exploring to find out, how do you explain what's going on? How do you explain what we see? What could I look at next to maybe give me a hint? Does this explanation work or not? But it is this adventure of what we don't know that makes science. It's not a recitation of what somebody else figured out.
Tell me about then the conference, the community that you brought together this year. I read the program saying 2019 Faith and Astronomy Workshop. Does that mean there have been others? Is this one of a series? Is it an annual event?
This is the 4th one we've held, and we hope to do these every 2 years. For 3 days, actually they come on a Monday and they leave on a Friday, we try to bring in a handful, 25 or so, people who teach science or religion and science, either as Catholic pastors or in Catholic schools or even in their own school or their own university. And what I want to be able to show them, they're very good in the book learning. I want to show them what astronomy looks like. So we go to the local places here in Tucson. We'll go to the Mirror Lab where they actually see what's involved in building a telescope mirror. We go to this time we went to the headquarters of the OSIRIS-REx mission. So you get an idea of the nuts and bolts of what actually the life of an astronomer is like. Because the real theme is that astronomy is not about stars and planets. Astronomy is about the people who study stars and planets. It's a very human activity, and that means that it's open to anybody, whether you're good at math or not, if you're interested in people and why people do the things they do and what they're curious about and what they're willing to put themselves through to be able to satisfy that itch of curiosity.
And at the same time, you're creating a community itself of folks who haven't come together before, but now are the graduating class of 2019 and may or may not return in future years. I want to ask you about the folks that you brought together to present, and I was lucky enough to see two of them, and people like Bob Tremblay, the NASA ambassador. Tell me how you met him and why you cast him in this year's production.
Well, the other thing that goes with being a kid fascinated by science was I was a kid fascinated by science fiction. And I've had a lifelong love of the stuff. And I don't mean the deep, heavy stuff that makes you wonder about the origins of the universe. There's a lot of science fiction that does that, and it does it pretty well. But they're not professional philosophers, and, as a Jesuit, I've had to study the real thing. What I love are just adventure stories. Stories that remind you that this universe of stars and planets is a universe where people can have adventures, even if the people have, 20 tentacles and are colored purple. As part of this love of science fiction, I've gotten to know other science fiction fans. And there are conventions of people. These aren't like the Comic-Cons where you go to meet your favorite author or your favorite, actor or whatever. These are more conventions of the people who love the stuff and are interested in writing. In some ways, they're professional conventions of writers or people who are thinking of being writers. And so the programs are often what's new in science, what's new in astronomy. What's it like to live in an absolute monarchy? Well, at the Vatican, I do that. I can tell them that sometimes it's not at all like you see in Game of Thrones, And as part of that community, I got to, certainly when I was living in Chicago as a Jesuit studying philosophy and theology, I got to know a group of these fans. A big organization that's now spread across the United States of kids who had met in high school and stayed in touch over the years. Some of them are now some of the leading experts in software. Bruce Schneier, the great expert in computer security, is a member of this gang who met them all in the time when they were all in high school together. Well, Bob Tremblay is a member of this gang. And over the years, we had met, we chatted, I gotten to know his wife, because she's a teacher, he loves astronomy, he loves meteorites. My research is centered on meteorites. And so I was in Detroit giving a talk, and he said, hey, come on out and, visit the family, come out for a dinner. At that time, I had just been made the president of the Vatican Observatory Foundation. And I had this dream of what I would like to do to bring us more visibility by using the internet, by having a daily or semi-daily blog called The Catholic Astronomer, where people could read about what we're doing and just what's new in astronomy and how do people of faith relate to this. And I could picture exactly what I wanted, and I'm describing it all to Bob, and I say, the thing that's stopping me is I just don't know enough HTML or all the other things you need to put one of these things together. I know enough computer stuff to know what I don't know. And this funny look comes on Bob's face, and he goes, you realize I do that for a living. Now, if you don't believe in prayer, let's just at least call that divine coincidence. Exactly the person I needed was sitting across the table from me, coming to the end of his career, looking for something astronomy-related that he could sink his teeth into to give up the consulting work that he was beginning to find kind of boring. So all of a sudden, all of his talents exactly complemented all of our needs. And so we brought him on board. Another person like this. As we were setting up the telescope here in Arizona, which is what got us to come to Arizona to build a telescope because the Roma skies were too bright, light pollution again. As we were coming here, one of the members of the astronomy staff at Stewart Observatory came to the director before me, George Coyne, and said, "What you're doing is great. I'd love to be able to participate." And she knew the Jesuits because she had taught at a Jesuit university, and she knew Catholics, being, someone who had lived and taught actually in Ireland for a while. I actually thought she was Catholic until she invited me to her son's bar mitzvah. So this is Brenda Fry, and she's one of the world's leading experts on the cosmology of galaxies and how galaxies grow and how galaxies evolve and what that can tell us about the origin and evolution of the universe. And she came to us and said, "Could I give a talk?" Well, she's spoken at every one of our conventions, every one of our little workshops, and she's so dynamic and she's so full of enthusiasm. Plus, she's a teacher. She can communicate the information in a way that our workshop participants can immediately grasp with hooks that they can then bring back to their own places, their own communities, their own places where they teach. So, two people there. The fellow who came in and demonstrated the meteorites when you were there, Larry Lebowski. Larry and I have known each other since we were both at MIT as students. He came out to Arizona in the 70s, about the same time I started graduate school here. At that time, I was writing a thesis with a professor at Arizona. It was my doctoral thesis. The secretary of my professor was a woman named Nancy Moore, who is now Nancy Lebowski, married Larry. And I joke that she's the only person in the world who's actually read my thesis because I paid her $1.25 a page to type it. This was back in the days before you could do things on a word processor. But she's also got a fascination both with religion, her degree is in theology, and with science. And she and Larry have been doing workshops for teachers, along with all of Larry's scientific work, for the last 30 years.
Nice. It's funny how those connections work out. Others?
So, I get an email out of the blue from a guy named Chris Graney, who teaches at a community college in Louisville, Kentucky. And you're thinking to yourself, I'm sorry, to be able to do really important research, you have to be at a big university, you have to be in Cambridge, you have to be in New York City. What can a community college teacher in Louisville do? Chris Graney is the first guy in probably 150 years. He and his wife are the first people who have had both a knowledge of astronomy and enough Latin that they can read the 17th century books, not just Galileo, but all of the other books written at the same time in favor of Galileo, against Galileo. And they have created, he's published now a number of books from the University of Notre Dame Press. He's published in Physics Today. He's published in the Journal of the History of Astronomy. He's the world's leading expert now on 17th century astronomy. And you go, well, the 17th century, that was kind of a long time ago. Why do we even need to care about that? Remember what I said. Astronomy is not at stars and planets. It's people understanding stars and planets. If you don't know your history, you're not going to understand why do we ask the questions we ask now. In particular, being at the Vatican Observatory, I'm always getting these questions about Galileo and church and science. You've got to know your history to know why did Galileo get in trouble. It's not the shorthand version you hear in the textbooks. Everything you know about Galileo is wrong. The truth probably doesn't make the church look any better, but it was a different mistake that they made, not the mistake that people think they made. And what's more, you read about the controversy of Galileo and his opponents. Who were his opponents? Where did they come from? Why were they opposed? Who was Christoph Scheiner? Who was Giovanni Riccioli? Who were these people? And you begin to see parallels between what they were doing and what we were doing. Nowadays, everybody's excited about dark energy. And is there an energy we don't know about? Can we plug this into the theory of general relativity, which has passed every test for the last 100 years? We don't want to abandon general relativity, but we've got this expanding universe, which isn't necessarily in the standard version of general relativity. Well, general relativity's been around for 100 years. We're really confident in it. Aristotle's physics had been around for 1,500 years. You can see why people were not so ready to just toss it overboard, because one guy had a crazy idea that actually he couldn't prove given the data of the time, which required a new physics that actually he didn't have quite yet. And it's real easy in retrospect to say, oh, well, they should have known. But in fact, there are a lot of crazy theories to our eyes that fit the data just as well. And when you know the history of that, and when you know how people make these decisions, then not only do you appreciate astronomy as this human struggle to try to understand, but you're a little more forgiving for the people who come up with ideas that may look like they're crazy to you, 90% of which turn out actually are crazy. And how do you tell the difference between an idea that's worth pursuing and one that isn't? You can't prove it's right until you've decided ahead of time that it's likely enough to be right that I'm willing to invest 5 or 10 years or a lifetime.
Now, speaking of history, tell me how a young kid out of Detroit, you don't grow up, even though you're fascinated with the skies and the stars and have access to a telescope and a supportive father, but do you go to bed at night saying, someday I'm going to be the Pope's astronomer? Do you? Or how did that come about? And as you begin to share that with us, can you tell us the difference between a Jesuit priest and a Jesuit brother, so that as we hear your story, we're able to put things into perspective?
Ah, so you want the long version.
Well, I know your time is restricted, but give me what you can.
Right. Okay, so I'm growing up in Detroit, fascinated by science, and frankly, in every way, I've got the breaks going for me. I've got a wonderfully loving family who are in the upper middle class, working for the auto industry at the very time when the auto industry was doing really well. And both my parents are college graduates. Indeed, my Italian immigrant grandpa, who came to America at the age of 7, had a college degree. He was a lawyer. He was a lawyer in Boston in the 1920s. So there was this enormous support and expectation that I would do well academically. But Italian dad, Irish mom, also this very deep faith. I grew up in a really good part of Detroit where everybody around me also had these advantages. So I grew up around other kids going to my grade school who were every bit as smart as me. To get into the Jesuit high school, you had to take a test, a standardized test. And by golly, I got 99th percentile, better than 99% of the people taking the test. There were 7 other kids in my class who got 99th percentile. That's the kind of school I went to. The nuns who taught me at Our Lady Queen of Martyrs grade school taught me science. They taught me really good math. They gave me extra work in algebra in the 7th grade because they saw that I was smart, and they did that for the other kids. So I never grew up thinking that there was going to be a conflict between science and religion. It was the religious people who taught me the science. Boy, that was an advantage. That was a bad idea I didn't have to rip up and throw away. And the hardest thing to learn is something new that you thought you already knew. So I had all the advantages there. Went to the University of Detroit High School, which was run by the Jesuits. And again, I got fabulous test scores. So did everybody else. I was a National Merit semifinalist. Guess what? A quarter of my graduating high school class were National Merit semifinalists. We're talking 40 kids. So I could be smart without being singled out. I could be smart and challenged by my friends who were every bit as good as me, if not better. That was a tremendous advantage. Graduating, I had no idea what to do because actually in the high school, I'd done the Latin and the Greek track. I'd done the classics track. I hadn't done the science track, partly because I figured I already knew the science, which at the level they were going to teach you in high school was true. I went off to Boston College. My dad was from Boston. Boston College was a Jesuit college. I had this idea in the back of my head. I might want to be a Jesuit priest. And I was going to be a history major. Maybe with the idea I'd be a journalist. I'd done some journalism. Maybe with the idea that I was going to be a lawyer like my grandfather. Maybe with the idea I didn't know what I was going to do. Who knows when you're 18? I show up, live in the freshman dorms. It's 1970. The world is falling apart. And kids are kids. A bunch of 18-year-olds living away from home for the first time. And the local liquor store will deliver to the freshman dorms. So it was Animal House. And I'm a nerd. Suddenly, I'm not surrounded by other nerds. And I just don't fit in, and I can't stand the smell of the stuff, and I can't stand the racket they're making outside, and I can't stand the fact that nobody else was working but me, and I'm working because I want to, but nobody else seems to want to. And what's worse, when their lives start falling apart, which is what happens when you behave like that as freshmen, they come to me and they start pouring out their problems, and I'm listening to all of their woes and this and that, nobody understands. And all I'm doing is thinking to myself, saying, yeah, of course. Life is tough when you're stupid. What do you expect? I couldn't stand it. So I thought, I got to get out of the freshman dorms. My high school girlfriend had dumped me. I got to get out of the freshman dorms. I'll join the Jesuits. So I was going to do that anyway. And a Jesuit priest I go to listens to all of this, and he goes, well, son, have you prayed about this? I'm 18. Who prays? Give me a break. Go to your room, he says. Close the door. Ask God, is this what he wants? Craziest thing I'd ever heard. So I go to the door, go to my dorm room, kick out my roommate who was dating the girl I'd been interested in. So I didn't like him anyway. Sitting on the floor, looking at the ceiling. Here I am, God. I know they're desperate for priests. They'll take anybody, Don't hear a thing. Dead silence. Feeling really foolish. While I'm waiting for the voice from the ceiling to, whatever. Question pops in the back of my head. What does a priest do for a living? I see them on Sunday telling everybody else how to live. I could do that. But the rest of the week, what do you do? Well, I guess they must have desks, papers on the desks. What are those papers about? About people. People with problems. People just like the idiots I'm trying to get away from. And it hits me, this would be the worst job in the world for me to take. I'm a nerd. I'm really good at doing nerd stuff. I'm never going to be an NBA basketball player. I just don't have the tools for that. I have the tools to be a nerd.
So what do you do?
My best friend from high school is going to MIT. When I visit him in the weekends, I discover that they've got the world's biggest collection of science fiction books. I transfer to MIT to get out of the freshman dorms and to read science fiction. But I've got to find a major. Engineering, I can't build anything. Physics, I'm a history major. I'm not going to go immediately into physics. Earth and planetary planets. That's like where people have science fiction adventures. I check that off. When I get to MIT, I discover, to my horror, that I have just signed up for the geology department. And I'm thinking, what could be more boring than rocks? There's a rock. There's another one. But then I discover that there are rocks that fall out of the sky. They're called meteorites. And the professor who's telling me about these is just brilliant and charismatic. And I wake up every Tuesday and Thursday thinking to myself, I get to hear John Lewis lecturing about meteorites. It gets me out of bed. Makes me excited like nothing else has. I give up the idea of being, a science journalist or a science lawyer, one of those lines that I gave when I got into MIT. And I said, I'm going to do the science. I want to know more about this stuff. I went off to Arizona to a brand new department in planetary science. One of the brilliant young men in the field who works in meteorites is a guy named Mike Drake, who it turns out invented the OSIRIS-REx mission that we visited last week. I get there. I get a PhD. I get a postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard College. I get another postdoctoral fellowship at MIT. And I'm 30 years old. And that little half of me that I had left behind at the Jesuit high school starts beating in saying, why do you do astronomy when people are starving in the world? Oh, what purpose am I fulfilling by writing a paper about the moons of Jupiter that 3 people in the world will read, and 2 of them are my enemies? What good is that? And I didn't have an answer. And oh my God, I'm turning 30 and I'm getting old and life is slipping by. Well, there's no problem so big you can't run away from it. So I ran away. I joined the Peace Corps. I said, I give up being a scientist. I'm just going to do whatever they want me to do in the Peace Corps. They send me to Africa. They send me to Kenya. Within 3 months, I'm teaching astronomy. I'm teaching astrophysics at the University of Nairobi to graduate students. Thinking, I could have done this back in Boston. But when I go up country to visit my other Peace Corps volunteer friends, and I set up a little telescope, and everybody in the village wants to look through the telescope, and everybody in the village wants to hear about the Apollo landings and the voyage to Jupiter with Voyager and the images that are coming back. And these are people, living in really nice mud huts, it turns out. Yeah, they're living in mud huts, but if you've ever seen those huts, those are really brilliantly engineered pieces of work. And they're very sharp people who just, didn't grow up in suburban Detroit, didn't have the advantages I had, but they had the same curiosity, they had the same intelligence, they had the same desire to know that I had as a kid. And it hits me finally. This is what makes them human beings. This is what makes us more than just well-fed cows, the desire to feed not just our bellies, but also our souls.
So what's the takeaway here?
We don't live by bread alone. I go back to America. I get a teaching job at a small college. My girlfriend dumps me again. Thank God, we were just not right for each other. And I say, now what do I do? Well, I already gave up the idea of being a Jesuit because I'm not right to be a priest. At that point, the little voice in my head goes, Jesuits also have brothers. Now, a brother doesn't say Mass, doesn't lead prayers, doesn't necessarily do all of that dealing with human beings that a priest has to deal with, people with problems, with stuff you're not good at. But you live in the same community. You do the same work. You support the rest of the community with the talents that you have. And the brothers might be cooks. They might be the guy who drives the bus. That's what I knew them at the high school. But they can also be the artists. There was a tremendous artist in Rome in the 1700s who was a Jesuit brother. They could be the scientists. They can be the one who create the reputation that let the other Jesuits do what they do. And I ask my friends, should I be a Jesuit? My ex-girlfriends all say, yeah, we could have told you that. My dad says, we could have told you that. Everybody was waiting. Everybody knew I had this vocation except me. I enter as a brother, and for the first time in my life, it's not that I was happy. I'd been happy before, but I was content. This is where I'm supposed to be.
And how did that make you feel?
Finally, all the pieces fit. The love of science, the love of language, the love of travel, the love of looking at the universe, the love of God that I'd had since I was a kid. I'd been a Catholic all of this time, but the love of science that I had, and the chance for intellectual growth, and the chance to live in a community of people, and every one of them is smarter than me, and it's so much fun to be constantly challenged in the best possible way, to run as fast as I can to keep up with them.
And the Jesuits, in fact, have a great track record in science and astronomy, amongst other sciences. I read somewhere there's some 28 or so craters on the moon named after Jesuits.
The first 28 craters on the moon with Jesuit names were named that because the guy who made the map was a Jesuit. One of those 17th century astronomers who actually was opposed to Galileo and the Copernican theory on very good scientific reasons, which turned out to be wrong. But there was no way they could have known they were wrong in the 17th century, knowing what they did. A fellow named Riccioli. He made the map. He started the tradition of naming craters for important scientists. And he's the one who chose to name the most prominent and important crater on the moon, crater Copernicus. Even though he didn't agree with the Copernican system, he respected Copernicus as a brilliant scientist.
Let me ask you a question. You must be aware of the very popular show, The Big Bang Theory. And of course, it was a Belgian who, in fact, posited that in the 30s or so, was it? No?
Georges Lemaitre, the Belgian priest with a degree from Louvain in mathematics, a degree, another PhD, 2 PhDs, one from MIT in astrophysics, was a brilliant and wonderful and incredibly important scientist of the 20th century. He was a diocesan priest.
Let me ask you this then, thanks to Lemaitre's work. The Big Bang Theory, the television series, how has that either helped broaden, educate, bring into popular culture the culture you've been describing for a few minutes? Or has it brought along any sort of challenges, or are there things there that they haven't exactly gotten right regarding the science?
Well, both my experience and all of my nerdly friends who watch it say, we didn't have nearly as much sex. The Big Bang Theory, though, has, I think, the TV show, has given the general public a sense of the fun of being a nerd, the fun of being a scientist, the fun as a human being of doing this very human thing. You look at these guys and you say they're so weird and they're so different, and after a while, part of the humor comes from the fact that you don't have to be a nerd to make the mistakes they make, to get into the scrapes that they do, to have the same embarrassment and the same problems and the same everything else. The Big Bang Theory, the TV show, has affected us in a slightly different way.
How so?
A few years ago, I was able to meet a fellow Detroiter named Bill Purdy, who's the producer of the Big Bang TV show, and he's become a supporter of the Vatican Observatory Foundation, even though, again, he's devoutly Jewish.
Tell me about the founding of the foundation, its purpose, and how it's going.
Back in the 1980s, we had in Castel Gandolfo a couple of telescopes at the Vatican Observatory. Vatican's had an observatory on and off for 500 years, but the modern incarnation started in 1891, and they had telescopes around the walls of the Vatican City. When city lights grew, then they moved out to Castel Gandolfo, which is the Pope's summer home. But by 1980, the lights were too tough there. And nobody could afford to build a new telescope in Rome. There was no dark place there. In Italy, the only dark places were also earthquake-prone. But the director of the observatory in those days was an American with a background here in Arizona. He had been at the Stewart Observatory of the university before going to the Vatican Observatory. He had friends here. And he said, why don't we just buy a house in Tucson, have a couple of astronomers live here, join the astronomy department at the University of Arizona, we'll rent some office space, and have access to all of Arizona's telescopes. And so that was the deal. It was just going to be a cheap and easy way for Vatican astronomers to have access to modern telescopes. And then, at the end of the 1980s, a telescope builder at the University of Arizona by the name of Roger Angel had come up with a new way of making telescope mirrors. And he'd got enough money to try out the system on one 1.8 meter mirror. And it worked. It worked like a dream. It was a beautiful mirror. So he came to George Coyne and he said, if we give you the mirror, will you build the structure around it to make the rest of the telescope, and we can share the telescope time? How much is it going to cost? About $5 million. The Vatican in the 1980s, they didn't have $5 million to throw away on this. But they said, if you start a foundation to raise money among people in America or anywhere else who wants to donate money to this, feel free to use the Vatican name, build it, and the telescope will then be the symbol, in many ways, of the Vatican Observatory. Not all astronomers use telescopes, but if you don't have a telescope, people don't realize you're a real observatory. So the work we do in the telescope is important, but the symbolism of the telescope is equally important. Now, the mirror that Roger Angel made, he actually had used an old abandoned synagogue on campus that was about to be torn down. And so we can now tell the world that the Vatican has a telescope whose mirror was made in a synagogue by an angel.
The only similar story I know, I just heard at the Kitt Peak Observatory a couple of days ago. I visited there to get a little bit of background on telescopes. And they have a distant peak you can see from the big house, so to speak. And on it are 4 different buildings representing 4 different universities. And as our guide or docent explained to us, the one with the round dome was from University of Michigan, and the other one next to it was from Ohio State University, making this the only place on planet Earth where, in fact, University of Michigan and Ohio State collaborate.
Indeed. Well, this whole idea of collaboration, whether it's telescopes that are shared by the University of Michigan and Ohio State, or astronomy that's shared by people who are deeply religious, as at the Vatican Observatory, or other places where there are lots of other deeply religious people of every religion you could imagine, working side by side with people who have no religion or people of a different religion. Where does that happen except in astronomy? In the height of the Cold War, the Russians, the Soviet Union as it was then, and Americans collaborated on a system of being able to rescue each other's spacecraft, and eventually in a system that we now call the International Space Station. The International Astronomical Union was founded right after World War I, 1919, in order to bring the astronomical community together in a world that had just been fighting each other terribly. The other great thing that happened in 1919 was the proof of Einstein's theory of general relativity. Einstein was a German. The guy who proved his theory was an Englishman. And this was done within a year of the end of World War I. Astronomy works because, as the International Astronomical Union puts it, we all live under the same sky. It's the one thing where we can be pulled out of ourselves, out of our daily worries of, what's for lunch, out of our daily prejudices. And everybody's got prejudices, except you and me, of course. And we can all be amazed at the same sky.
Now, speaking of prejudices, I have a card here that has a quote from you in one of the many presentations I've seen you make online. And it had to do with the difficulty, because you had a quote, and it had to do with the fact that we were so culturally ingrained that it was very difficult for us as humans to think outside of what we know or what we think we know. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
It goes back to a point I make before. It's important to remember that science, astronomy is not stars and planets, astronomy is human beings. And human beings decide what they're going to study before they know the answers. And they decide the techniques that they're going to apply to that study before we know whether or not this is going to work. And we make these choices based on intuition, based on experience. If your experience and your intuition turns out to be right, you're hailed as a genius. If your intuition and experience turns out to be wrong, you're ridiculed as being, prejudiced.
And I want my money back as a university funding you.
Right. And it means that if you don't recognize the human side of astronomy, you're missing all the fun. You're missing all the things that makes it so challenging. And you're demanding certainty in a field where if there was certainty, it would be boring. You don't fall in love with somebody knowing how it's going to turn out 70 years later. That would not be love. You don't support a sports team knowing that they're going to win the game. That would be boring. It is this hope, it is this passion that comes out of not knowing. And to be able to admit, I was wrong, or to be able to insist, no, I was right, the experiment was flawed, let's go back and do it again. And sometimes the first is the truth, and sometimes the second is the truth. And you don't know until it's all over and done with.
But there's enough there that keeps you coming back for more.
You've got to have enough successes that you at least have hope. And you've got to have enough failures to keep yourself humble. The best scientists in the world are the ones who are wrong 75% of the time.
I may be a scientist and not know it. That's about my ratio. Before we get too far away from the International Astronomical Union, you, in fact, received an honor from them about 15 years ago for your study of meteorites and comets. They named asteroid 4597 Consolmagno. May I call you 45 for short? So that had to be fun. Tell me about those moments when things seem to go right, or when you get that kind of acknowledgement from the community that you're a part of, that you must be doing something right 25% of the time, or we wouldn't think so highly of you as to name an asteroid after you or give you the Carl Sagan Medal.
It's certainly reassuring to have the community recognize that you're doing the right thing. We are a community of people. You don't do science by yourself. Crazy Doc Brown inventing the time machine in the movies, that's not real science. And if you didn't have people believe in what you're doing enough to cite your papers, then you've got no reason to write the papers. That said, the real moments of joy do come alone. When suddenly you plot your data up and you try this variable versus that variable and you see a beautiful curve rather than just a scatter of dots, and you go, oh my gosh, there's a relationship there. This is cool. But the reason to me why, my next reaction is not only is this cool, boy, my friends are going to be astonished when I get to tell them about this. And it's that community of being able to communicate the idea that allows you to say, we're building this cathedral, here is this beautiful brick that I've just created that might fit right there in that part of the wall.
On one of my cards here, it says, and this is probably again from one of your presentations, scientists are almost always wrong because they view the theories through the lens of the best science and information available at the time. So that must be, to some extent, frustrating as well when you're in the 75% failure neighborhood. But the high points bring you back for more?
One of my favorite movies that shows what it's like to be a scientist or an engineer is the first Iron Man movie, which I'm told they kind of made up as they were going along. But the scene where Tony Stark is trying to figure out how to make the Iron Man suit work, and it's hilarious, all of the failures, and you can see the frustration. But us as the audience, that makes the movie so much better than, oh, I just flipped a switch and here's my magic powers and I'm going to go off and beat up the bad guys. That human moment is what makes that such a brilliant movie. It's the failures that not only teach you where the truth is, but it's the failures that give that spark of flavor, that little tang, that little irritation of the spice that you weren't expecting, that makes the goulash taste all the better.
Now, this question or assumption did not come from the Disney organization, but I read somewhere you helped demote Pluto as a planet?
One of the rules that the IAU has is that you cannot name asteroids after pets. And we all know Pluto is Mickey Mouse's pet, so Pluto couldn't be an asteroid. I think that was the state of the arguments as to what Pluto was.
So tell us then about the Pluto that you demoted.
Pluto is not demoted. If you think that being a planet is somehow better than being some other kind of, object out in space, you're guilty of planetism. You're saying that planets are somehow superior. How dare you? There are wonderful things out in space that are far more fascinating in their own way. Comets. Comets are gorgeous in a way that a planet might not be. Why do we classify things? We classify them in order to be able to compare them against each other so you're not comparing apples and oranges. Pluto is one of a class of objects that we've got a handful of now, 6 or 7, that you could name as the term we've got, which is not a very good term, but nobody's come up with a better one, is a dwarf planet.
Again with the Disney reference.
And there are 7 dwarfs, right? The idea of having a group of objects that we can compare against each other means we want to have a classification for that group. When Pluto was the only one we knew, there was no point in creating a new classification just for it. But it was the discovery of these other objects, Eris and Makemake and Haumea and a bunch of the other ones like that, that made you suddenly realize, oh, there is something that's been going on in space all this time that we weren't aware of. And when we said Pluto was a planet, that was one of that 75% of the time that seemed good at the time. Turns out, not quite.
So now, with the advances in technology and being able to see closer, thanks to technology that flies faster and looks further than it has before, a host of theories or what we thought we knew are about to, I don't want to say tumble, whole entire new doors and galaxies are about to open.
It's important to understand how science works. It's not that I prove that the other guy was wrong. It's that he was right but there's more going on that he didn't know about. It's not that what the nuns taught me about religion when I was 5 years old was incorrect. It's that they're teaching me the most I could handle when I was 5 years old. But now that I'm 65 years old, I hope I have a deeper understanding, whether it's the science that I was taught at age 5 or the religion I was taught at age 5. I'll go back to another movie reference. You remember the movie Jerry Maguire? And there's this little kid who is the boy genius. And he's reciting all of these amazing and totally pointless facts, like, how many pounds does a human brain weigh? When you're a little kid, science to you is just accumulating the data. Because that's where you are. You're still trying to make sense of the universe. As you get older, you learn that science is putting the pieces of data together and like assembling a jigsaw puzzle. When you get older than that, you not only look to the fact that the puzzles fits together, but there's a picture in the puzzle once you put it together properly. And this looking for deeper and deeper insights doesn't mean that finding the pieces that were square or round wasn't important. You had to do that. It doesn't mean fitting them together wasn't important. You had to do that. But you can't stop there. You have to keep looking deeper. And that's why we never run out of things to do in science. Because the more we know, not only the more we realize we don't know, but the more we know, the more opportunities we have to understand in ways that were not given to us before. The data that we're collecting now is not just spacecraft. Spacecraft are great. They're telescopes. We have telescopes with detectors that can see things that the old photographic plates couldn't see. It's theories. We have ideas of how to put things together so that a huge advance in our understanding of how solar systems in general, plural, evolve comes, number one, because we see more than one solar system. Couldn't do that back when I was a student. But number two, we have a theory called chaos theory in mathematics that allows us to handle orbits that are not always the same, and that allow us to have new tools to pry apart questions that before we wouldn't have even thought about. It is that opportunity to take new tools to old data, take new ideas of looking at things that everybody knows, that makes science always exciting, and also something that's open to the amateur now. You can be a teacher at a community college in Kentucky and make world-class advances in our understanding of how our science got to be the way it is. You can be a guy who could never handle the math but loved astronomy so much that he looks through a telescope every night and be the world's current great comet discoverer, David Levy. You can be someone who has a telescope in his backyard with a new CCD camera that can take images not just of the galaxies but the area around the galaxies and show details of how the galaxies interact with each other that we not only didn't know about 30 years ago, we could not have seen with our professional telescopes, which are designed to look very, very closely at a very small area, rather than the amateur who can look at the big area. And this community of everybody, the amateurs, the professionals, the little kids who ask you the embarrassing questions. I had somebody said, why are meteorites rocks? Kids, because why are meteorites rocks? Meteorites come from the gas and dust. So how come meteorites are hard rocks and not just dust bunnies? And suddenly you've got a whole new question coming from a very innocent, question at a public audience that triggers a whole new realm of research.
I have a whole new question as well. I want to, in the time we have left, I want to move from this vibrant aspect of your life, science, and into the other vibrant aspect of your life, which is your religion. And I've heard you say that you are a fanatic and a nerd, fanatic about the science and a nerd about the religion. Let me ask you about the arc of the relationship you have with, speaking of invisible things, although I know the Jesuits see God and everything, the relationship between you and the Creator, and how that has progressed, if you will, from the age of 5 to the age of 18 to the 25, the 30-year-old, the 40-year-old entering the order to where we sit today. I've heard you describe worship as play, and that you playfully interact with the Creator. Tell us a little bit about that perspective on life and religion and what you do for a living?
The real connection I see between my science and my faith goes back to that experience I had when I was wondering at age 30 as a postdoc, why am I doing this? And it really is one of the great questions. Why am I doing this experiment instead of that experiment? Why am I doing science instead of working in a bank? Why did I choose to have curry tonight instead of having a hamburger? How do I make these decisions? The universe exists, and I can ignore it or I can delve deeply into it. And which I choose to do has something to do with my cosmology, my way of looking at my life, why I'm here, why I do what I do. Because I believe in a God who believes in me, because I believe in a God that I know I can never understand, and yet, to a certain degree, I can understand, which kind of parallels the way I feel about that universe, which I know I can understand, but I'll never understand completely. That gives me, number one, the courage that I can actually make sense of the universe, because I believe that whoever made it, did it in a way that was accessible to my meager set of tools. It gives me the courage to do it because it tells me that the universe is real. It's not just an illusion. It's not just something that I should meditate to a higher plane and leave behind, which goes along with knowing how to love the universe. I could say that chocolate was a tool of the devil to lure me into acne, or I could say chocolate is a sign of God's love. And I'd rather choose the second. But it also means that by studying the universe, I get closer to the Creator. However I'm going to picture the Creator, I can tell you something about Shakespeare by the way he writes plays. I can tell you something why Shakespeare is, different from George Bernard Shaw in the way they wrote plays. I can tell you something about the Creator of the universe because the universe was made this way and not that way. The personality of the universe comes through in the creation. Now, why do I believe that there's a Creator? I could postulate that there was no Creator and come to a physical universe that just sort of maintained itself. Philosophically, you run into the Wittgenstein problem of, how do you find meaning in the thing itself? You can't. The meaning of a thing has to be outside the thing, which means the God I believe in has to be supernatural, not just a nature God, not just the intelligent design God who's inside nature, but a God who's outside and yet permeates nature. But I also see in creation a sense of play, a sense of joy, a sense of beauty, all of those things that are real but not quantifiable. You heard about the guy who tried to come up with a scale of beauty and defined the millihelen as the amount of beauty sufficient to launch one ship? You can't do that! And yet, a universe without beauty wouldn't be fun enough to study that I'd want to spend my time doing it. To me, that is the reinforcement that I am finding God in the universe.
Heaven knows there's that much space and material up there that you have to work your way through in order to get there. You use a lot of metaphors in your teaching. I have to tell you, one of the remarkable aspects of your presentations is the fact that you make complex concepts accessible to non-scientists like myself. And you use the crossword puzzle as a metaphor of your play or interaction with the Creator. Tell me a little bit about that as we regrettably come to an end of our conversation.
I love crossword puzzles. There was a fellow who had been doing theology and had read a statement by Thomas Aquinas. So my theology is so much, straw to be burned. Why do I bother doing it then? And I go, well, what do I do with the crossword puzzle book when I'm finished? Throw it in the fire. Because it's the doing where you find the joy. And we communicate through metaphor. Science itself is a metaphor. The path of a falling object is like the solution to this equation. The equation isn't the gravity. The equation isn't the object. But the metaphor of the equation lets us see things in the object that we wouldn't have noticed otherwise.
I'll take that to heart. Brother Guy Consolmagno, thank you so much for allowing me and our listeners into a glimpse at the kind of life you've led and continue to lead, and all best wishes on all your ongoing and upcoming adventures, wherever they may take you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for giving me a chance to tell some of my favorite stories.
Believe me, they're going to become other people's favorite stories as well. Thanks so much. Bye now. Well, thank you for listening to this episode of Fred Keating and Friends, and of course, a special thanks to our guest, Brother Guy Consolmagno, S.J., for his time and the photos he provided to illustrate some of the subjects that we covered here today. I also want to thank Chris McIntosh of Postal Audio Inc. in Vancouver for ironing out the wrinkles in the conversation, the team Simon, Sheena, and Kelsey at Lindisfarne Productions AB Inc. for their constant support and post-production work on the images. I want to take this opportunity to thank the Vatican Observatory Foundation, NASA, also known as the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, the NSSDC, the National Space Science Data Center, as well. I want to thank Jack and Mary Catherine Keating for keeping the stars in my eyes, and I want to especially thank those dogged astral detectives that make up the international community of astronomers. And of course, you, dear listeners, for taking the time to open your mind. Till we connect again, all best wishes on all your ongoing and upcoming adventures. Fred Keating, saying goodbye for now. This interview took place in Brother Guy's bungalow at the Jesuit residence in Tucson, Arizona, on Friday, January 18th, 2019.